Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Language Arts Gallery. Today, we're going to continue with our academic writing and research course, and we're going to talk about sampling today. So, we're going to identify different sampling strategies. We're going to talk about probability sampling. We're going to talk about non-probability sampling. And finally, we're going to talk about why it's important to justify the method that you've chosen. So let's get started. When you think about the word sampling or sample, what comes to mind? Now, I think, first of all, I think about things like free samples, maybe taste testing something in the grocery store. But when we think about research, what do we think of when we think of sample? I think it's easy to think about something that a scientist might do a test on, but we're thinking about something entirely different when we talk about it in the context of our research. So, what is sampling? Sampling involves selecting a subset of the population. The population is the entire group that you're wanting to study, but you're not going to study everyone. You're just going to study a small subset of that population, and that is your sample. How we select that sample, well, that varies. So, why do we sample a population to begin with? Why not just study everyone? Well, first of all, it's often very difficult, if not impossible, to survey everyone or to study everyone. It's also very expensive. And if you were able to study the entire population, it would take a really long time. So this allows researchers to save time and money. Sometimes when the population is unknown, the exact number of people is unknown, or it's a very hard to reach population, we need to establish a strategy for sampling that group. So there are two main types of sampling, probability and non-probability sampling. And we're going to talk about each one. So probability sampling is just when each member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. And as you could probably guess, non-probability sampling is when not every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. Of course, probability sampling is better, but it's often more difficult to perform. So there are four different approaches to probability sampling that we are going to talk about. They are simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, systematic sampling, and cluster sampling. So let's go over each one. Starting with simple random sampling. In simple random sampling, every member of the population has an equal and independent chance of being selected. So how does this work? First, we have to know exactly who's in the population. That's our sample frame. We have to list everyone that's included in that population. If you don't know the entirety of the population, that is a problem for simple random sampling. So how does this work? Well, first, we got to create that list, right? We've got to list all the members. We're going to assign each one of them a number. Now, we need a random method of selecting people on that list. It could be a random number generator, some type of lottery method, or some sort of random table that allows us to select participants. So the good things about simple random sampling, it eliminates any selection bias, right? Because we've got that random number generator that's picking numbers. There's 500 people in our sample, or I'm sorry, in our population, and we list them all. Every person is listed with their number. The random number generator says number 147, that person's included. Number 62, that person's included, and so on. So there's no selection bias. It's easy to understand and apply if you have a complete list, and it's generalizable provided your sample is sufficiently large. The downside to simple random sampling is you have to complete that sampling frame, and that can be very difficult and time consuming. It can also be costly if you've got a very large population and a geographically dispersed population. And if you don't know the entirety of the population, well, then you can't do this, right? Stratified random sampling is when you divide your population into subgroups. The subgroups that you're dividing them into are your strata. And you're going to choose some characteristic that's relevant to your study. Once you divide the group into these different strata, then you're going to perform random sampling in each stratum. So first, you need to identify those strata, and it can be based on any relevant demographic. And that's something related to your study. It could be gender, age, income level. Then you got to see who fits into each group. So, for example, if you're talking about men and women and you're looking to survey, you've got 1,000 employees in the population and you're looking to survey 200 of those, and you've got 600 men and 400 women to get a balanced representation, you might divide it into two strata, 100 men and 100 women. After you divide the population into these different strata, then you use that simple random sampling technique to select those participants. So pros and cons of this method, well, you're making sure that all subgroups are represented. And we saw that with that previous example. You've got 600 men, so you've got a greater likelihood that men are going to be represented if you were to perform a random sample on that entire population. So this way, dividing it into strata, then there's equal representation of men and women. It's more precise and it improves statistical power, provided that the strata are internally homogeneous. What does this mean? That means that members are more alike with respect to the characteristic being measured, not what identifies them as part of a particular stratum, but what you're studying. So they're more alike within that particular stratum than across different strata. The downside to this is you need that detailed information about the population to create those strata, and it's more complex to administer than simple random sampling because you need that information, you need to divide them. Our next is systematic sampling. So here, similar to random sampling, but it's a little bit easier. You're going to select every nth member of a list, and you're going to start from a particular point. So again, you need a complete list of all the members of the population. So you're going to arrange the population into list order. Now, you're not assigning everyone these random numbers. You're going to decide on a sampling interval. I'm sorry. So you're going to start with your population size, and then you're going to divide that by your desired sample size. Okay. And then you've got to pick a random starting point between 1 and k, which is that sampling interval. So it's best if we look at an example here. You've got 1,000 people. You want a sample of 100. So you're going to take that population, that's 1,000. Your desired sample is 100. So 1,000 divided by 100. K, your sampling interval, is 10 because it's 1,000 divided by 100. So now you're going to pick a random number between 1 and 10. Say it's 4. Okay, then you're going to select the 4th, the 14th, the 24th, and so on, right? You're starting with 4 and you're increasing by k, by that sampling interval. So pros and cons, well, it's simpler and quicker than simple random sampling. You don't need any automatic number generators. You don't need to number every member of the population. This is good with physical samples. If you're talking about like quality control and manufacturing, you might do something like this. The downside is that there may be hidden patterns within the list. So say we're selecting every 10th name like we did in our example. If every 10th name is from the same department, then you've got the potential for bias within that sampling method. And as we said, you don't need to assign number to every member of the population. Cluster sampling. So in this particular method of sampling, you divide the population into clusters, and this can be based on geography or some other type of grouping, like schools, districts. This is important when you're doing a study where your participants, your population is geographically dispersed. You might be studying school districts in the state of New York. You might be studying Title I schools throughout the United States of America. So, what you're going to do is you are going to break these into these groups. Then you're going to randomly select clusters. Now, you can do one of two things. You can either do one stage cluster sampling, where once you have selected your clusters, randomly selected your clusters, you are going to survey everyone within that selected cluster. You can also do two-stage cluster sampling. Now, this, of course, is going to depend on the sample size that you need. So you are going to then randomly select individuals within the clusters that you randomly selected. So suppose for a national survey, you randomly select 10 cities. What you're going to do then is interview everyone in those cities. That would be one stage. That would be very difficult. Or you are going to sample households within those cities. That would be two-stage sampling. So pros and cons, it's cost effective if you've got to do one of those large surveys where all your members of the population are geographically dispersed. If you've got to travel, if you've got to administer surveys, this can be costly and it can be time consuming. The downside to this is clusters may not be homogeneous. You may have sampling error. It's less precise than simple random sampling or stratified sampling if those clusters really differ. So let's talk about non-probability sampling. And we've got convenience sampling, purposive sampling, snowball sampling, and quota sampling. So these are less statistically precise. We're going to start with convenience sampling. Like the name implies, this is just selecting participants that are easiest to reach. They're most readily available. So how does this work? Well, you choose individuals who are either nearby, they're ready and willing to participate, they're easily contactable. There's no randomization, and there's no formal sampling frame. So I was conducting a study on teachers in South Korea, and I chose to source participants from a Teachers in South Korea Facebook group. That was a form of convenience sampling. Okay, pros and cons, fast, cheap, very easy to carry out. This is really good if you've got to do a pilot survey, super easy. The downside, of course, highly prone to selection bias. It's not representative of the population or generalizable. Purposive sampling, okay? When we perform purposive sampling, we are selecting participants based on specific characteristics or criteria. This is different than exclusionary or inclusionary criteria for a study. So with this type of sampling, we are going to identify qualities and experience that are required in our participants. And only individuals who meet those criteria are selected. Now, I think it's easy to say, well, that sounds a lot like inclusion and exclusionary criteria. So I've got an example here, and we'll talk about how it's different. If you're doing a study on first-year university students and they're adjusting to campus life, you're intentionally recruiting only first-year students from different faculties. That's purposive sampling. That's who you're selecting, right? Now, within that, we can have inclusion and exclusion criteria. So, for example, we have to select students who are living on campus. We are excluding students who it's their first year at this school and they were already a first-year student at another school. They've transferred here. So that would be an example of how we talk about who we want to sample, and from that sample, who's included and excluded. Some pros and cons. Well, we can ensure that the people that we're selecting have exactly the characteristics, the experience, the knowledge, whatever it is that we're looking for this study. And it's excellent, particularly when we want to do very rich qualitative studies. There is a strong potential for researcher bias in participant selection here. And of course, it's not statistically representative of the population. Snowball sampling. So this is a very unique and interesting method of sampling, and this can be a very good, very appropriate method of sampling depending on who your population is, particularly when you're dealing with very vulnerable populations that might be unwilling to initially agree to work with you. So in this type of sampling, existing participants either recruit or refer new participants. So you get sort of a referral chain. You start with a small group of participants that are relevant to your study, and those participants suggest others. Okay, and that continues until you meet the desired sample size. So if I was doing a study on refugee student experience with education in a refugee camp, it might be very difficult to reach that population, members of that population. So I might have one participant who introduces me to other people within that network. Pros and cons. This is very useful for reaching those hard to access populations. And again, it builds trust because the person who is introducing that new participant to the researcher has a connection with both people. There is a strong bias because this is based on interconnected social networks, right? You might be getting people who feel the same way about a particular topic because they are friends with the people that you're already talking to. So you're really not truly capturing that diversity that's represented within that population. And again, if you're dealing with vulnerable populations, there are ethical concerns surrounding anonymity. Finally, quota sampling. So your population is divided into subgroups, and a fixed number of people, a quota of participants, is chosen from each. Okay, selection is done within the quota, it's non-random. So this is different than stratified sampling, where we've got that random element. So we're going to identify categories. Again, it could be age, gender, education. We're going to set that required number for each group, and then we're just going to recruit participants who meet that quota until we have we've reached our, or I should say, meet that criteria until we've reached our quota. And we're purely using convenience methods. An example here, you're doing a survey where you want to approach 50 men and 50 women who are shopping in a particular store, right? So that's your subgroups, male and female, and you just approach shoppers until you've got 50 men and 50 women. So if you're just approaching shoppers based on convenience and you've got 50 males and 35 females, from now on, you're only going to talk to females because you've already met your quota. You've got the desired number of male participants. So pros and cons, you're ensuring that you're including those key subgroups very fast, cheap, easier than that stratified random sampling. Within each quota, selection bias occurs. Again, this is basically convenient sampling divided based on groups. And it's not truly representative because your participants aren't randomly chosen. Now let's talk about justification. So first of all, what is justification? Justification is your rationale for choosing what method of sampling you chose for your study. Why did you do this? Why is it important to justify your choice? Well, you need to show why the method was chosen, right? We're going to say, okay, I chose snowball sampling. That's saying what it is. You need to say why you chose it. This builds credibility with your audience. Hopefully, you're matching that sampling strategy to your research questions, to your participants or your population, to your methodology. So you didn't just randomly choose a method of sampling. And it also helps your readers to make decisions about the validity of your findings. So thinking of justification versus telling what sampling method you're using, think of this as what versus why. Okay, what would be the study used purposive sampling? Why is the study used purposive sampling to ensure participants had direct experience with the phenomenon under investigation? So again, we always want to connect the sampling method to the research question or the method. And I've got some language frames that we can use here to help us. And you can copy these down. These are not copyrighted. These are things you can use in your research. The sample was chosen because, given the study's focus on, participants were selected to ensure representation of, the sampling method was selected to allow, or this approach was appropriate because. I probably always use that one when I'm writing. I say this approach was appropriate because. So to finish up, I want you to think about what are your research questions? Think about your population, who you're sampling, how you're sampling that population, the methods you're employing, and what method would best match your study. So if you've already chosen a sampling method, think, is this the best approach, or do I need to change this going forward? And then you can draft a statement of justification for the methods that you've chosen. All right, thank you so much for joining me. Please remember to like, subscribe, and comment on the video, and I'll see you in our next video at the Language Arts Gallery.